My name is Clara Vance. Before I learned to dissect a balance sheet, I learned the scent of sawdust and linseed oil in my grandfather's workshop. He was a carpenter, a man who believed in the integrity of a well-made thing. He built chairs meant to last lifetimes and cabinets whose doors would never sag. His hands, calloused and kind, taught me that value wasn't just a number, it was the sum of honesty, effort, and time. He and my grandmother saved for 40 years, pouring that same quiet integrity into a retirement account they believed was as solid as the oak he worked with. Then, one day, it was gone. Vanished into the complex jargon of a financial advisor who had sold them a dream and left them with dust. That loss didn't just take their money, it took the light from my grandfather's eyes. It replaced the scent of cedar in his workshop with the cloying smell of anxiety and shame. He passed away 2 years later, and I believe with all my heart that he died of a broken spirit. That quiet devastation became the foundation of my life's work. I pursued forensic accounting not as a career, but as a Kalinga way to restore the balance that had been stolen from my family, a way to give a voice to the quiet victims whose trust had been methodically dismantled. This is the story of how I spent a year of my life as someone else, living within the walls of a gilded cage to find the rot within. It's a story about a company called Hawthorne Trust and Investment, but more than that, it's a story about the lines we draw for ourselves, the cost of silence, and the unexpected ways that integrity can find its own light in the darkest of rooms. The quiet hum of the climate control system was the only sound in the conference room. It was a space designed to project an aura of calm, unshakable stability, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured lawns of Port Blossom's financial district, a mahogany table polished to a mirror shine, leather chairs that sighed when you sat in them. It was a room that smelled of old money and quiet confidence. Julian Croft, my direct supervisor, shattered that calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He placed a slim, leather-bound folder on the table with a soft thud that echoed louder than a shout. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the faces of my 5 colleagues before they landed on me. There was a flicker of something sharp and triumphant in them, the look of a predator that has finally cornered its prey. "We have a serious internal matter to discuss," he said, his voice a low, measured hum. It was the tone he used when addressing the board, smooth, controlled, and utterly devoid of genuine warmth. "There's been a security breach. An internal investigation has been underway." I watched the subtle shift around the table. It was like a flock of birds turning in unison. Shoulders angled away from me. Eyes that had met mine with friendly greetings just an hour ago were now intensely focused on notepads, coffee cups, the intricate grain of the mahogany. In that instant, 11 months of shared project deadlines, catered lunches, and polite inquiries about my weekend evaporated. I was no longer Evelyn Reed, the dependable senior accountant from Chicago. I was an island, and the tide was going out. An investigation into what, exactly? I asked. My voice was steady, a small victory in the sudden, roaring silence of my own mind. Julian opened the folder, his movements deliberate, theatrical. Unauthorized access to client-sensitive servers. A pattern of data queries outside of your designated department. Significant activity logged during off-peak hours. He ticked off each point, his gaze never leaving my face. "It paints a rather troubling picture, Evelyn." The team's avoidance was palpable. Lena, who had just this morning shown me a picture of the new rose bushes she'd planted for her aging mother, was now studying a smudge on her water glass as if it held the secrets of the universe. Samir, who'd regaled us yesterday with tales of his son's winning goal at a soccer tournament, was suddenly fascinated by the workings of his silver wristwatch. These were good people, I believed, caught in the undertow of a corporate culture that prized self-preservation above all else. They were afraid, and their fear had made them strangers. "We've been monitoring your digital footprint for several weeks," Julian continued, a faint, reptilian smile playing on his lips. He was enjoying this. The public dismantling of an employee was a demonstration of his power. The evidence is, shall we say, conclusive. My hands were damp, not from fear, but from a surge of adrenaline that was cold and sharp. This was happening too soon. My own timeline had us pegged for another 4 weeks of data collection. Julian's paranoia had outpaced my caution. "I'd like to see this evidence," I said. "That's not how this works." He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished surface. "This is a resignation agreement. It includes a confidentiality clause and an admission of improper conduct. You sign it, we provide you with a modest severance package, and this all goes away discreetly. You'll be escorted from the building this afternoon." The unspoken alternative hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. "Don't sign, and we will ruin you." "And if I refuse?" His smile tightened, crinkling the corners of his cold eyes. "Then things become significantly less discreet. And far more unpleasant." The room held its breath. My colleagues were no longer just colleagues, they were spectators at an execution, horrified but unwilling to intervene. They had praised my meticulous work, my collaborative spirit, my willingness to stay late to help them meet a deadline. Now, they were witnesses to my destruction, their silence a form of consent. I reached slowly for my phone on the table beside my notepad. "This isn't a negotiation, Evelyn," Julian snapped, his voice losing its silken edge. "You don't get to call a lawyer." I ignored him, my fingers moving with a calm I did not feel. I pressed the number 2 on my speed dial. A single ring, then a click. "Hello," a familiar voice answered. I kept my eyes locked on Julian's. "Hi, David," I said, my voice infused with a warmth I hoped sounded authentic. "I'm so sorry to call you at work, but it's a family emergency." Julian lunged slightly, his hand hovering over the table as if to snatch the phone away. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" I held up a hand to stop him, my expression one of practiced apology. "I know we talked about waiting until the weekend," I continued into the phone, my gaze unwavering, "but things with Dad's estate have gotten complicated. The papers for the Riverside property need to be signed today." Yes, the ones at the Hawthorne branch. Chaos, when it came, was not loud. It was a series of quiet, panicked movements. My department head, a nervous man named Arthur, pushed his chair back so quickly it nearly tipped over. 2 senior managers who had been silent observers now exchanged a wide-eyed glance and moved instinctively toward the door. The rest of the team just stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning apprehension. "She's bluffing," Julian hissed, his face flushing a blotchy red. "Security." I stood up slowly, placing my phone face down on the table. "Am I?" The lone security guard appeared in the doorway, his expression uncertain. He looked from Julian's furious face to my calm one. For one terrifying, heart-stopping moment, I thought my message had been too subtle, my signal missed. Was my teen not in place? Then I heard it. Not the thunder of footsteps, but the quiet, purposeful tread of multiple people moving down the carpeted hallway. "Federal agents," a calm voice announced from the doorway. "Everyone, please stay exactly where you are." Julian Croft's face was a study in collapsing realities. His rage dissolved into disbelief, then into a pale, sickly fear as a half-dozen men and women in plainclothes filed into the room. They weren't my colleagues from Hawthorne Trust. They were my real colleagues. "This is absurd," Julian stammered, backing away from the table. "We were handling a standard employee disciplinary procedure." "Save it, Mr. Croft," said Agent Morales, the calm voice from the doorway, as he produced a pair of handcuffs. "We've heard quite enough over the past 11 months. He gestured with his chin toward my lapel, where a pin, disguised as a small silver leaf, had been broadcasting every word. The faces of my former colleagues swam before me, their expressions shifting from judgment to shock to a dawning, horrified understanding. I wasn't Evelyn Reed, the quiet accountant from Chicago. As Julian was read his rights, his eyes met mine. In them, I saw the thing I had worked a year to see, the sudden, shocking realization that he was not untouchable. It was the beginning of justice for 843 people, retirees, young families, recent immigrants who had no idea that their trust, like my grandfather's, was being systematically plundered, $50 at a time. This wasn't the end. It was simply the end of the beginning. My name is Clara Vance, and before I walked into Hawthorne Trust with a fabricated resume and a silver leaf on my lapel, I was a forensic accountant with the FBI's white-collar crime division. I had chosen this path not for the thrill, but for the quiet satisfaction of balancing the books on a grander scale, of restoring order where chaos and greed had reigned. The complaints about Hawthorne Trust had been trickling in for years, small whispers of discrepancy that were easily dismissed on their own. A retired teacher noticing a recurring administrative fee she couldn't account for. A young couple seeing their savings account balance consistently off by a few dollars. A recent widow who was told she must be confused about her late husband's investments. Individually, they were minor issues. But when I mapped them out, a pattern emerged, a quiet, insidious siphoning that targeted the most vulnerable, the people least likely to make a fuss, people who, like my grandparents, had been taught to trust the experts. No one builds a criminal enterprise around stealing $20, my section chief had argued when I first proposed the undercover operation. They do, I'd countered, if they steal $20 from thousands of people, month after month, year after year. Traditional methods had failed. Warrants for financial records had been met with meticulously clean, doctored books. Hawthorne was a fortress of plausible deniability. We needed someone on the inside, someone who could not only trace the money but understand the culture of quiet complicity that allowed the scheme to flourish. That someone became me, Evelyn Reed. Unassuming, efficient, a woman who brought homemade cookies to the office potluck and remembered the names of her colleagues' children. Getting hired was surprisingly easy. The months that followed were a masterclass in duality. I spent my days building trust and my nights building a case. I learned that Lena's mother had Alzheimer's and that Lena's greatest fear was not being able to afford her care. I learned that Samir coached his son's soccer team with a fierce pride that was both heartwarming and profound. I became their friend, their confidant, all while secretly mapping the labyrinthine system Julian had engineered. It was a work of subtle genius. Fractional fees applied and then partially reversed, leaving behind cents that no one would notice. Systematic rounding errors, always in the bank's favor. Service charges for accounts that fell below a certain threshold, a threshold that was mysteriously, temporarily lowered by automated transfers just before the charges were applied. Each method was a tiny, insignificant cut. But thousands of tiny cuts can drain the lifeblood from an account. The money was funneled through a series of internal clearing accounts before being wired to a private equity firm, Sterling Capital, which invested it in legitimate-seeming real estate ventures. By month 7, I had the full map. By month 10, I had identified the key players within Hawthorne. The plan was to let the scheme run through one more quarter-end cycle to gather irrefutable proof of the transfers to Sterling Capital. But Julian's internal audit, likely triggered by my deep dives into archival data, had forced my hand. He had done this before, I later learned. Discrediting and firing curious employees was his preferred method of pruning the hedges, a warning to others not to look too closely at the carefully manicured gardens of Hawthorne Trust. This time, he had tried to prune the wrong person. After the arrests, the adrenaline drained away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. I sat in a sterile debriefing room, the scent of strong, bitter coffee filling the air. "Exceptional work, Vance," Morales said, sliding a styrofoam cup toward me. "We've identified 17 individuals within Hawthorne. Initial estimates put the total fraud at over $14 million. The victims," I said, my voice hoarse. "When can we start the asset recovery?" "Already in motion. The hard part will be identifying everyone. Some people probably never even noticed the money was gone." I thought of Mrs. Gable, a frail woman in her 80s who came into the office every month, her bank statement trembling in her hand, insisting that her balance was wrong. She was always treated with a cloying, patronizing patients by whichever manager was on duty, made to feel foolish and forgetful. I thought of the young mechanic who was saving for a down payment on a small house, whose account was kept just low enough by the fees that he never qualified for the loan. The system was designed to prey on their self-doubt. Walking out of the Hawthorne building for the last time, I felt an unexpected wave of sorrow. For all its corruption, it had been my world for nearly a year. I had shared in Lena's small joys when her mother had a lucid day and celebrated with Samir when his son's team won their championship. They weren't criminals, they were just ordinary people who had learned not to ask questions. And they had turned on me in a heartbeat. That night, alone in the small, anonymous apartment that had been Evelyn Reed's home, I packed her life into cardboard boxes. I took down the generic stock photos of a smiling, non-existent family. I washed the faint, pleasant scent of her vanilla perfume from my clothes. I scrubbed my face until the last trace of the unassuming, approachable woman I had pretended to be was gone, leaving only my own tired reflection in the mirror. For the first time in months, I called my father without having to use coded language. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice tight with a year of unspoken worry. "The first part is," I said, looking out the window at the distant, glittering lights of Port Blossom. "Now comes the long part. Will you be safe?" I thought of Julian Croft's face as the handcuffs clicked shut, the cold calculation that had replaced his shock. Men like him didn't just lose, they sought retribution. "Yes," I lied. "It's just paperwork from here." But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the quiet order I had fought so hard to restore was about to be threatened by a storm I couldn't yet see. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and often through mud. The next 3 months were a grueling marathon of legal preparations. The case had expanded, pulling in sterling capital and implicating its enigmatic CEO, Richard Sterling. Our 17 defendants became 23. I was Clara Vance again, but the ghost of Evelyn Red lingered. I would catch myself using her turns of phrase or instinctively reaching for the brand of tea she preferred. Identity, I was learning, is a garment that can leave its shape on you long after you've taken it off. 6 weeks after the arrests, Morales knocked on my office door. "Heads up. Julian Croft hired Marcus Thorne." My stomach tightened. Thorne was a defense attorney legendary for 2 things: his astronomical fees and his talent for eviscerating witnesses on the stand. He didn't just argue facts, he constructed narratives, turning heroes into villains and victims into conspirators. "They're claiming entrapment," Morales continued. "And they've filed motions to suppress all the wire evidence, arguing you were a rogue agent on a personal crusade." He hesitated. "They're digging into your family history, Clara. Your grandfather." I placed my pen down with deliberate care. "That was 20 years ago. To Thorne, it's Exhibit A. He's building a story that you were emotionally compromised, that you manipulated evidence to get revenge for your family." Later that evening, as I walked to my car in the fading light, a familiar sedan pulled up beside me. The window slid down, and Samir looked out, his face etched with anxiety. "Evelyn. I mean, Agent Vance. Can we talk for a minute?" Against my better judgment, I got in. The car smelled of stale fast food and his son's soccer cleats. "I didn't know," he said immediately, his hands fidgeting on the steering wheel. "About any of it. I swear. I believe you, Samir. They've been questioning us. The investigators, the lawyers. They make it sound like we were idiots for not seeing it, or worse, that we were part of it. My wife. She's terrified I'm going to be charged." This was the collateral damage, the ripples of devastation that spread far beyond the initial crime. "If you told them the truth, you have nothing to worry about," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "There's something else," he said, his voice dropping. "Lena got a call. From Julian, from jail. He was asking all sorts of questions about you. What files you looked at, who you talked to during lunch." My pulse quickened. "And Richard Sterling. The CEO from Sterling Capital? He's been calling the office, asking about off-site data archives and server backup protocols. I thanked Samir for the information and urged him to speak to the prosecution team. As he drove away, I called Morales. They're not just defending, they're probing. They're looking for a weakness in our data chain. 2 days later, our key witness Hawthorne's former IT director who had agreed to testify about how the fee structure was programmed was found unconscious in his garage. Carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty generator. He survived, but with cognitive deficits that clouded his memory of the intricate coding details. The local police called it a tragic accident. We called it witness tampering and moved 2 other witnesses into protective custody. The real blow came during the preliminary hearing. Marcus Thorne, in a masterful piece of legal maneuvering, had somehow obtained internal FBI emails from before the operation began. Agent Vance, he addressed me on the stand, his voice resonating with false sincerity. Would you characterize your investigation of Hawthorne Trust as impartial? Yes, it was. He held up a printed email. Then perhaps you can explain this line. From a memo you wrote to your supervisor, this pattern of predation is sickeningly familiar. It's the same quiet theft that destroyed my family. I will not let it stand. The prosecutor's objection was overruled. You lived a lie for 11 months, Agent Vance, Thorne continued, his voice rising. You pretended to be someone named Evelyn Reed. You befriended people under false pretenses. Isn't it possible that your deeply personal, and dare I say, obsessive quest for what you call justice led you to interpret routine banking procedures as something sinister? No. The evidence is in the financial records. Evidence you alone gathered, filtered through the lens of your own past trauma. By the time I stepped down, the damage was done. Thorne had successfully painted me not as a professional agent, but as a vigilante driven by a personal vendetta. That night, sleep was a distant shore. The case wasn't lost, the paper trail was still undeniable, but my credibility, the very foundation of my testimony, had been fractured. My phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. Parking garage, level 4. Gray Prius. 10 minutes. Come alone. Every instinct, every line of protocol screamed at me to ignore it. But a deeper feeling, a gut certainty, told me this was important. I slipped my service weapon into the waistband of my jeans and took the elevator down. The garage was a concrete cavern, dimly lit and smelling of exhaust fumes. The gray Prius was parked in a far corner. As I approached, the driver's side door opened. Lena stepped out. She looked smaller, more fragile than I remembered, her face pale and drawn in the fluorescent glare. I shouldn't be here, she whispered, her eyes darting nervously around the empty garage. But I can't stop seeing her face. Whose face? Mrs. Gable's. The old woman who used to come in every month, crying about her statement. Julian had me walk her through it once, tell her it was just her memory failing her. And I did it. I believed him. Her voice cracked. She passed away 2 months ago. Her son told me she'd been cutting her heart medication in half because she thought she couldn't afford the full prescription anymore. I waited, letting the silence hold the weight of her confession. After the arrests. After they tried to fire you. I started looking. At the accounts I managed. At the patterns. She pushed a small flash drive into my hand. This is the original programming directive for the fee algorithm. It was supposed to be wiped during a system upgrade last year, but I kept a copy. It has Julian's digital signature on the authorization. She then handed me a small notebook. And these are the dates and times Julian called me from jail. He kept asking me to access old server logs. He said it was for his defense, but he was threatening. Subtle things. Mentioning he knew which facility my mother was in. Why are you giving this to me, Lena? Her gaze hardened with a sudden, fierce resolve. Because I was the one who helped Mrs. Gable set up her automatic bill payments years ago. I smiled and told her she wouldn't have to worry about a thing. Her voice dropped to a barely audible whisper. And because this morning, someone left a photograph of my mother's care facility on my car's windshield. After Lena left, I took the evidence straight to Morales. The flash drive was the smoking gun we'd been missing, direct, irrefutable proof linking Julian to the creation of the fraudulent system. This changes the game, Morales said. We need to get Lena and her mother into protective custody, now. But we were too late. When agents arrived at her small house, she was gone. A single suitcase was missing. Her phone was left on the kitchen counter. Her frantic neighbor said Lena had received a call, then left in a hurry, saying only that there was a family emergency. The next morning, Marcus Thorne withdrew his motion to suppress the wire evidence. By the afternoon, 3 of the lower-level defendants had approached the prosecution, asking to negotiate plea bargains. They're turning on each other, Morales said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. The dam is breaking. For the first time in weeks, I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to solidify. But the victory felt hollow. Lena's car was found at a regional bus station, wiped clean. There was no record of her buying a ticket. She had vanished, leaving behind a crucial piece of evidence at an unknown cost. That night, my apartment buzzer rang. It was a courier with a certified letter. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address for an abandoned cannery on the industrial waterfront, a dated a Morrowind time, 10 p.m. No name, no message. It was a trap. It had to be. And yet, the neat, precise handwriting felt strangely familiar. I showed it to Morales. Absolutely not, he said. We'll put a surveillance team on it, but you are not going anywhere near that place. I agreed, but the note nagged at me. At 9:45 the next evening, Morales called. Surveillance is in place. The cannery is dark. No activity. At 9:50, I received another anonymous text. Time is running out. Sterling knows about Clara, not just Evelyn. My real name had never been made public. Only our team and the defendants knew the connection. At 9:55, ignoring direct orders, I slipped out my building's service entrance, bypassing my own security detail. I took a cab to within a few blocks of the cannery and approached on foot through the thick, salty fog rolling in off the water. The building was a skeletal ruin, windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. A side door was slightly ajar. I drew my weapon and slipped inside. The cavernous main floor was empty, save for a single wooden chair in the center. On the seat was a manila envelope. After clearing the space, I approached the chair. The envelope contained another flash drive and a handwritten note. The Sterling Capital transaction links you couldn't find. Get out. I had barely registered the last 2 words when I heard the heavy, metallic clang of the door locking, followed by the soft, insidious hiss of gas. My lungs seized. I sprinted for the door, yanking on the handle, but it was barred from the outside. The room began to tilt, the edges of my vision blurring. As my knees buckled, I heard the faint, distant sound of sirens. Then, only darkness. I woke to the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor and the sterile scent of antiseptic. Morales was standing by my bedside, his face a mixture of profound relief and simmering fury. You disobeyed a direct order, Vance. You could have been killed. He softened, just slightly. Whoever left that drive for you also called 911 and reported a gas leak. They saved your life. He held up an evidence bag containing the flash drive. And maybe our case. It contains the complete, unredacted transaction logs between Hawthorne and Sterling Capital. Everything we needed to prove intent and conspiracy. Who? I rasped, my throat raw. We don't know. But they wanted you alive, and they wanted us to have this. As I recovered, the case against Julian and his co-conspirators became an avalanche. New witnesses came forward, emboldened by the undeniable evidence on the drive. But a chilling question remained: who had tried to kill me, and who had saved me? And where was Lena? 3 days before the trial was set to begin, Richard Sterling, the untouchable CEO of Sterling Capital, was found dead in his secluded mountain home. It was ruled a suicide. A typed confession was conveniently located on his desk, admitting to his role in the scheme. It was too neat, too clean. His death severed the link to whoever might have been above him. The night before the trial, my office phone rang. The voice on the other end was electronically distorted. "The game isn't over. Tomorrow, check the defense's witness list." The line went dead. The next morning, an amended witness list was delivered to the prosecutor's office. There, under the heading Witnesses for the Defense, was a single name: Lena Miller. The woman who had risked everything to help us was now scheduled to testify against us. Anya Sharma, the lead prosecutor, was pragmatic. "She's been turned. They threatened her, or they paid her, or both. If she takes the stand and recants, if she claims the fee structure was legitimate, she could poison the jury against all our evidence." We spent hours trying to anticipate her testimony, but we were flying blind. That evening, another courier delivery arrived at my apartment. This time, it was a hotel key card. Room 812. With a call to Morales to track my location, I went. The hotel room was empty, the television playing a muted news report about the trial. A burner phone on the bedside table began to ring the second I closed the door. "Did you come alone?" It was Lena's voice, strained and tinny through the phone. "Yes." "Lena, are you safe? Where are you?" "Listen to me," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't have time. They have my daughter, Clara." It was the first time she had ever used my real name. "They sent me a picture of her at daycare, with one of their men standing behind the fence." The message was clear. "I testify the way they want, or..." Her voice broke. "Tomorrow, on the stand, I'm going to do what they say. But I need you to do something. Have Anya ask me about Directive 7. "What's Directive 7? It doesn't exist. It's a ghost protocol. When I say I don't know what it is, press me. Ask if it was part of the annual compliance review. Make it look like you're trying to trap me in a lie. Lena, this is too dangerous. We can get you and your daughter out." "No. Their reach is too long. The only way is through. Please, Clara. Trust me. Directive 7. The line went dead. The next day, the courtroom was electric with tension. When Lena took the stand, she was a stranger. Her movements were stiff, her face a blank mask. For 30 minutes, she calmly and methodically dismantled our case under the gentle questioning of Marcus Thorne, testifying that the fees were industry standard and that any discrepancies were due to legacy software issues. When it was Anya's turn, she began with simple questions, laying a foundation. Then she caught my eye. I gave a slight nod. "Miss Miller," Anya said, her tone casual, "I'd like to turn your attention to Hawthorne's internal compliance procedures. Specifically, Directive 7. Can you explain your role in its implementation?" Lena's composure flickered. Just as she'd predicted. I'm not familiar with that directive." "Really?" Anya feigned surprise. "It was a key part of the annual compliance review you oversaw, was it not?" "No," Lena said, glancing at the defense table where Julian Croft watched her, his expression unreadable. "There was no such thing." "Are you certain?" "Because we have internal documentation that suggests otherwise." Anya walked toward the witness stand holding a folder full of blank paper. Lena's eyes darted from the folder to the gallery, then back to Anya. A silent, desperate communication seemed to pass through the air. Then, her posture changed. A subtle straightening of her spine, a hardening of her gaze. "There was no Directive 7, she said, her voice suddenly clear and strong. But there was another, undocumented directive. One that came directly from Mr. Croft and Mr. Sterling. It was a system designed to systematically round down interest payments on accounts held by elderly clients and non-native English speakers. A system they called the Legacy Account Stewardship Program. The courtroom erupted. Thorne was on his feet, shouting objections. But it was too late. For the next hour, Lena, protected by the legal framework of Anya's questioning, laid bare the entire conspiracy. She had been playing a different game all along. The story about her daughter was real, but she had used their coercion as a shield, allowing her to take the stand for the defense and deliver testimony they could never have anticipated, testimony that was far more damning coming from their own witness. She had memorized account numbers, dates, and transfer amounts. She was not a victim, she was a weapon. As soon as the judge called a recess, Lena was swarmed by federal marshals and taken into protective custody, along with her daughter, who had been picked up from her daycare by a tactical team the moment Lena began to speak. The victory was immense, but it came with a sting. That evening, 2 agents from Internal Affairs met with me and Morales. Thorne had filed a motion for a mistrial, citing witness tampering. They had security footage from the hotel of me entering the floor where Lena was being held. The trap had been twofold. They had coerced Lena, but they had also anticipated that I might try to contact her. Ms. Miller contacted me, I explained carefully. She was under duress. Her child had been threatened. And you chose not to follow protocol and report this to your superiors or the court, one of the agents asked, his face impassive. My career flashed before my eyes. I had broken the rules, and in doing so, I had jeopardized the entire case. I was suspended, pending a full investigation. The judge denied the motion for a mistrial but ruled that my testimony would be struck from the record. I was officially off the case. They had found a way to silence me after all. For a week, I was a ghost, watching the trial I had built from the outside. The prosecution was holding its own, but small inconsistencies, planted in the data archives by Sterling's people, were creating doubt. Then, late one night, Morales showed up at my door, violating my suspension. They're winning, Clara. They altered the server data. Subtle changes. Enough to make our witnesses look confused and our evidence look sloppy. We were so engrossed in the files he'd brought that we didn't notice the faint, sweet smell, or the way the air in my apartment grew heavy and still. It was Morales who noticed it first, a sudden dizziness. Gas, he choked out, stumbling toward the door. We collapsed in the hallway just as the world faded to black. I awoke in the hospital, again. This time, the guards outside my door were armed with tactical rifles. Rodriguez was already awake, his face pale. Hydrogen cyanide, he rasped. They pumped it through the ventilation. Someone on the inside gave them the building schematics. He leaned closer. This goes higher than Sterling. He was a piece, not the player. The attempt on our lives triggered a new level of federal oversight. I was to be moved to a deep-cover safe house until the entire network was dismantled. As they prepared to transport me, Morales handed me a secure satellite phone. You have 1 hour, he said. Make it count. I called Anya Sharma. The evidence is corrupted, she said, her voice strained. Thorne is tearing our timeline apart. There's another source, I said, a desperate idea forming. Regulatory backups. Hawthorne had to transmit daily transactional summaries to the Federal Reserve. They won't have the detail we had, but they might be enough to prove our data has been tampered with. Those are sealed under administrative lock, she countered. It would take months to get a subpoena. Richard Sterling's executive assistant, Eleanor. She quit 2 weeks before he died. She managed all their regulatory communications. If anyone knows a way to expedite access, it's her. With Morales's help, I spent my last hour of freedom hunting for a woman who had vanished. I found her in her hometown, at Tiny, on a map in rural Ohio, living in her childhood home. Morales arranged for the local sheriff to do a welfare check. The sheriff called back an hour later. "She's fine, but she's terrified." When I mentioned the FBI, she asked me to give Agent Vance a message. He read out a string of numbers. A date and a timestamp from 9 years ago. "It's not a transaction," I realized aloud. "It's a system log. From an old server migration she once complained to me about when I was Evelyn." Morales pulled a string with a contact at the federal. 20 minutes later, we had the file. The timestamp Eleanor had given us marked the exact moment a new, seemingly benign account balancing algorithm had been installed on Hawthorne's servers. It was the seed from which the entire fraud had grown. And in the authorization log for its installation was a name we had never seen before, Arthur Kensington, chairman of the Federal Banking Oversight Committee. The pieces clicked into a terrifying new picture. Kensington hadn't just been protecting the scheme, he had designed it. He had seeded it into multiple banks and then moved into the very regulatory body meant to police them, a wolf guarding the henhouse. He had access to our investigation files, witness protection details, my home address. As the protective detail arrived to take me away, Morales met my gaze. "I'll handle this," he said. "We're not done." For 2 weeks, I lived in silence and fear. Then, one morning, a handler gave me a phone. It was Anya. "It's over, Clara," she said, her voice filled with a weary triumph. "Kensington and 4 other committee members were arrested yesterday." "Julian and the rest?" "They all took plea deals." "What happened?" "How?" "You happened." "But the final move. That wasn't ours." She explained that Eleanor, Richard Sterling's former assistant, had created a dead man's switch. A video confession, complete with documentation she had copied for years, was automatically sent to the board members and major investors of every implicated bank the moment Kensington was taken into custody. Faced with undeniable proof and public ruin, the entire conspiracy collapsed on itself in a cascade of confessions and betrayals. Months later, after my reinstatement, I sat in the back of a federal courtroom and watched Arthur Kensington receive a 30-year sentence. The restitution fund for the victims was the largest in the state's history. After the sentencing, I found Anya packing her briefcase. "There's one last thing I don't understand," I said. "Eleanor. We never spoke. How did she know she could trust me with that timestamp?" Anya smiled. She wasn't trusting Agent Vance. She was trusting Evelyn Reed, the quiet accountant who once spent her lunch break helping her untangle a complex data migration issue from 9 years ago. The woman who, while they worked, mentioned offhandedly that her grandfather had been a carpenter who believed in building things that last. Outside the courthouse, the sun was bright. I called my father. "It's done," I said. "Your grandfather would be proud, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just that you won, but that you did it his way. You found the flaw in the grain, and you made it right." Justice, I realized, isn't always a thunderous verdict. Sometimes, it's the quiet, meticulous work of restoring what was broken. It's a series of small, honest acts, of flash drive past in a dark garage, a cryptic message from a woman you barely know, a memory of a grandfather's workshop that, when joined together, becomes strong enough to tear down a fortress of lies. The books were finally, truly, balanced.